The gavel echoed through courtroom 302, sealing her fate, or so he thought. Her billionaire husband had just spent 2 hours tearing her down, calling her a worthless parasite who rode his coattails. She didn't cry. She just smiled, reached into her leather briefcase, and prepared to destroy him. The air inside the Cook County Circuit Court in downtown Chicago was stifling, thick with the kind of tension that only accompanies the bitter dismantling of a 15-year marriage. Rain battered the high, arched windows, casting long, weeping shadows across the mahogany panels of courtroom 302. At the plaintiff's table sat Nathaniel Hayes, the golden boy of the Midwest tech scene. Impeccably dressed in a bespoke, charcoal Brioni suit, Nathaniel radiated the easy, dangerous confidence of a man who was used to winning. He was the founder and CEO of Omnitech Solutions, a data logistics empire whose software was currently utilized by everyone from FedEx to the Department of Defense. His net worth hovered comfortably around the 800 million mark. Beside him sat his lead counsel, Preston Gallagher. Preston was a notorious Chicago divorce attorney, a shark in a silk tie who had made a lucrative career out of shielding wealthy men from the financial fallout of their infidelities. Across the aisle, sitting in stark contrast to her husband's formidable legal army, was Caroline Hayes. Caroline wore a simple navy blazer and a modest strand of pearls. For 15 years, she had been the quiet shadow behind Nathaniel's blinding spotlight. She was the woman who managed his estates in Aspen and Miami, who hosted the agonizingly dull charity galas, and who smiled for the cameras while Nathaniel accepted Innovator of the Year awards. Today, she sat perfectly still, her hands neatly folded in her lap, listening to the man she once loved systematically dismantle her worth as a human being. Your Honor, if we examine the financial disclosures provided in Exhibit C, the narrative becomes glaringly obvious. Preston Gallagher boomed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. He paced in front of the judge's bench, holding a thick binder aloft. We are dealing with a prenuptial agreement signed in 2011. My client, Mr. Hayes, built Omnitech from a dingy garage in Evanston to a Silicon Valley juggernaut. He worked 80-hour weeks. He suffered sleepless nights, ulcers, and near bankruptcy to secure the Cisco contracts that put his company on the map. Preston stopped pacing and turned, pointing a manicured finger directly at Caroline. And what, pray tell, was Mrs. Hayes doing during this decade of grueling innovation? She was shopping on the Magnificent Mile. She was redecorating a $14 million brownstone. She was, as the financial records irrefutably show, a purely depreciating asset. She contributed nothing to the capital, nothing to the intellectual property, and nothing to the corporate strategy of Omnitech. In the context of this wealth generation, she was entirely, unequivocally, worthless. The word hung in the air, heavy and cruel. Worthless. In the gallery behind them, a few reporters scribbled furiously on their notepads. This was a high-profile case, and the media was hungry for blood. Nathaniel had recently filed for divorce, so he could publicly be with his 26-year-old director of marketing. He wanted Carolyn out, and he wanted her out cheap. The prenup stipulated a modest alimony, $2 million, a microscopic fraction of his current wealth. Judge David Patterson, a severe man with a silver beard and zero tolerance for courtroom theatrics, peered over his reading glasses. Mr. Gallagher, I understand your position, but let's stick to the legal arguments. The court does not need character assassinations. My apologies, Your Honor, Preston said smoothly, though his smirk betrayed him. I merely seek to establish that the plaintiff's request to enforce the prenuptial agreement as written is entirely fair. Mrs. Hayes is demanding a 50% stake in Omnitech, claiming she was an equal partner. It is a frivolous, insulting demand. She was a homemaker, and while society values that role, the corporate bylaws of a billion-dollar tech firm certainly do not. Nathaniel leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his legs. He shot a brief, mocking glance at Caroline. He expected her to be in tears. He expected her to be crumbling under the public humiliation. Instead, Caroline was eerily calm. She didn't look at Nathaniel. She was looking down at a yellow legal pad, occasionally making a neat, precise note with a Mont Blanc pen. Beside her sat her attorney, Madeleine Rousseau. Madeleine wasn't a celebrity lawyer. She operated out of a modest office in Lincoln Park, known mostly for her meticulous, forensic approach to corporate litigation rather than flashy divorce drama. Madeleine sat with her hands steepled, watching Preston's performance with the detached interest of someone watching a predictable play. "Does the defense have an opening statement, or shall we proceed directly to the witness testimony?" Judge Patterson asked, clearly eager to move the morning along. Madeleine stood up slowly, smoothing the front of her skirt. "We will reserve our statement for later, Your Honor. We are more than ready to hear Mr. Hayes testify under oath about his sole creation of Omnitech." Preston chuckled dismissively and called Nathaniel to the stand. For the next hour, Nathaniel Hayes regaled the courtroom with the mythology of his own genius. Guided by Preston's expertly crafted questions, Nathaniel described his tireless work ethic. He spoke about the coding architecture, the late nights, the brilliant strategic acquisitions he had made in 2015 that allowed Omnitech to corner the data compression market. "Mr. Hayes?" Preston asked, leaning against the wooden rail of the witness stand. "Can you clarify for the court the turning point for Omnitech, the moment it went from a struggling startup to a market leader?" "Absolutely," Nathaniel said, adjusting his tie. "It was the integration of the Nexus algorithm. We acquired the rights to this proprietary data compression tech in late 2014. It revolutionized how we processed cloud storage. It essentially halved server costs for our clients overnight. And did Mrs. Hayes have any part in acquiring this technology? Did she negotiate the deal? Did she evaluate the code?" Nathaniel laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. "Caroline?" "No. Caroline doesn't know the difference between Java and a cup of coffee. I facilitated the acquisition through an anonymous third-party broker. I saw the potential, I took the financial risk, and I made the deal." "Thank you, Mr. Hayes. No further questions," Preston said, returning to his seat with a triumphant stride. He had successfully painted Nathaniel as the solitary titan of industry and Caroline as the clueless, pampered dead weight. Judge Patterson looked over at the defense table. "Ms. Rousseau, your witness." Madeleine Rousseau stood up. She didn't carry a binder. She didn't pace. She simply walked to the center of the courtroom, holding a single manila folder. "Good morning, Mr. Hayes," Madeleine said, her voice mild, almost polite. "Morning," Nathaniel replied, leaning forward on his elbows, projecting total alpha male dominance. "You spoke quite passionately just now about the Nexus algorithm," Madeleine began. "You stated it was the turning point for your company. Would it be fair to say that without the Nexus algorithm, Omnitech wouldn't hold its current valuation of $800 million? It's a foundational piece of our architecture, yes," Nathaniel conceded. "But a tool is only as good as the man wielding it." "Of course," Madeleine smiled thinly. "Let's talk about how the man acquired this tool. You stated you bought it from an anonymous third-party broker in 2014, a company called Signet Ventures. Is that correct?" Nathaniel frowned slightly. "Yes. It was a blind acquisition. Standard practice in tech to avoid inflating the price if the seller knows a major player is interested. Right. You paid Signet Ventures a flat fee of $2 million for the perpetual licensing rights to use the Nexus algorithm, correct? It was the best deal of my life, Nathaniel bragged, looking toward the reporters. They severely undervalued their own IP. Did they? Madeline murmured. She opened the manila folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. She handed a copy to the bailiff to pass to the judge, and another to Preston Gallagher. Mr. Hayes, I'm showing you what has been marked as Defense Exhibit A. Do you recognize this document? Nathaniel squinted at the paper. It looks like the licensing agreement between Omnitech and Signet Ventures. Look closer at Section 4, Paragraph B, the exclusivity clause. Preston Gallagher suddenly stood up, his face reddening. Objection, Your Honor. Where is counsel going with this? This is a divorce proceeding, not a corporate audit. The acquisition of an algorithm a decade ago has nothing to do with the prenuptial agreement. Your Honor, Madeline countered smoothly, Mr. Hayes's entire argument rests on the premise that my client contributed nothing to the marital assets and therefore deserves nothing beyond the prenup. I am simply establishing the true nature of those marital assets. I promise this is highly relevant. Overruled, Judge Patterson grunted. But get to the point, Miss Russo. Madeline turned back to Nathaniel, who was suddenly looking a little less comfortable in his bespoke suit. Mr. Hayes, could you read Section 4, Paragraph B aloud for the court? Nathaniel cleared his throat. It says, the licensee, Omnitech Solutions, is granted exclusive use of the Nexus algorithm for a period of 10 years, commencing on October 1st, 2014. Upon the expiration of this term, the licensee must renegotiate terms with the licensor or cease all use of the proprietary code. The courtroom went dead silent. The only sound was the rain lashing against the glass. Madeline checked her watch. Mr. Hayes, what is today's date? Nathaniel stared at her, the color slowly draining from his face. It's October 3rd, 2024. So, as of 2 days ago, your company's legal right to use the foundational code that runs your entire empire has expired. Is that correct? Preston Gallagher shot out of his chair. Objection. This is an ambush. This is a corporate matter to be handled by Omnitech's legal department, not relevant to— It is highly relevant, Your Honor. Madeline's voice cracked like a whip, shedding its previous mildness. Because if Omnitech no longer possesses the rights to its core architecture, its valuation isn't $800 million. Without that algorithm, Omnitech is in breach of contract with the Department of Defense, Cisco, and 3 major airlines. Without that code, Omnitech is effectively worthless. Panic flickered in Nathaniel's eyes. He gripped the edge of the witness stand. That's a clerical oversight. We have an automatic renewal clause pending. My lawyers are contacting Signet Ventures this week to iron out the renewal fee. Have they had any luck contacting Signet Ventures, Mr. Hayes? Madeline asked, tilting her head. They're an anonymous holding company. It takes time to trace the registered agents through the Delaware system. Nathaniel snapped, losing his cool for the first time. We'll pay whatever the renewal is. It's a non-issue. It's not a non-issue, Mr. Hayes, Madeline said, walking back to her table. She picked up a thicker stack of documents. Because Signet Ventures is not an anonymous holding company anymore. As of this morning, Signet Ventures LLC filed public disclosure documents to unseal its ownership registry in the state of Delaware. She handed the documents to the bailiff. Your Honor, I submit Defense Exhibit B, the unsealed corporate registry and articles of incorporation for Signet Ventures LLC. Judge Patterson put on his reading glasses, flipping through the pages. His eyebrows shot up toward his hairline. He looked over the bench, staring directly at Caroline Hayes, who was still sitting with her hands politely folded in her lap. "Ms. Russo," the judge said, his voice hushed, "is this document accurate?" "It has been verified by the Delaware Secretary of State, Your Honor," Madeline replied. Nathaniel looked frantically between his lawyer, the judge, and his wife. "What is it?" "Preston. What does it say?" Preston Gallagher was looking at his copy of the document. The shark-like swagger was completely gone. He looked like a man who had just stepped on a landmine. "Nathaniel," he whispered, his voice trembling. Madeline turned to face the courtroom, locking eyes with Nathaniel. "Mr. Hayes, you testified under oath that your wife, Caroline Hayes, knows nothing about technology, that she is a depreciating asset, that she contributed nothing to your wealth." Madeline raised the document so the gallery could see it. According to these state-certified documents, the sole founder, 100% shareholder, and chief architect of Signet Ventures, LLC, the owner of the Nexus algorithm that your entire company relies on to survive, is Caroline Hayes. A collective gasp swept through the reporters in the back. A cameraman dropped a lens cap. Nathaniel froze, his jaw slack. He stared at his wife as if he were seeing a ghost. Caroline finally looked up from her legal pad. She met Nathaniel's horrified gaze across the room. She didn't gloat. She didn't sneer. She just offered him a small, polite smile. The exact same smile she had used to greet his billionaire friends at all those agonizingly dull garden parties. "You called her worthless, Mr. Hayes," Madeline said softly into the deafening silence of the courtroom. "But it appears she is the only thing keeping your empire from crumbling to dust." "Fraud!" Nathaniel's voice shattered the stunned silence of the courtroom. He leapt from the witness stand, his face flushed a mottled, dangerous crimson. "This is absolute fiction. It's forgery. My wife can barely operate her smartphone, let alone author military-grade compression software." Judge Patterson slammed his gavel, the sharp crack echoing like a gunshot. "Mr. Hayes, sit down immediately, or I will have you held in contempt of court. You will not have another outburst in my courtroom." Nathaniel sank back into the leather chair, breathing heavily, his hands gripping the armrests until his knuckles turned white. He looked at Preston Gallagher, desperate for his high-priced bulldog to tear this absurdity to shreds. But Preston looked physically ill. The swaggering attorney was frantically flipping through the unsealed Delaware registry, his eyes scanning the legal seals and notarized signatures. "Mr. Gallagher," Judge Patterson prompted, his tone dripping with impatience. "Does the plaintiff have an objection, or are we going to accept Defense Exhibit B into evidence?" Preston swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Your Honor, we object on the grounds of marital fraud. If this document is indeed genuine, it proves Mrs. Hayes actively deceived her husband, operating a shell company to siphon funds from Omnitech under false pretenses." Madeline Russo didn't even blink. "Siphon funds? Your Honor, Mr. Hayes just testified, under oath, that he voluntarily paid $2 million for a license he deemed the best deal of his life. It was a legitimate business transaction between two corporate entities. There is no fraud in selling a product to a willing buyer." "She hid her identity," Preston shouted, pointing a shaky finger at Caroline. "She used a registered LLC, which is a perfectly legal corporate shield in the state of Delaware," Madeline countered smoothly. "A shield, I might add, that Mr. Hayes uses for 3 of his own real estate holding companies. Is it fraud when he does it, Mr. Gallagher?" Judge Patterson sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. The exhibit is admitted. Ms. Russo, you have the floor. I suggest you explain exactly how a woman deemed a depreciating asset came to own the architecture of her husband's empire. Gladly, Your Honor, Madeleine said. At this time, I call Caroline Hayes to the stand. Caroline rose gracefully. She walked to the witness box, placed her hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. She sat down, adjusted her navy blazer, and looked directly at her husband. The polite smile was gone, replaced by a gaze so terrifyingly cold that Nathaniel physically recoiled. Mrs. Hayes, Madeleine began, pacing slowly in front of the jury box. Your husband testified that you spent the last decade redecorating and shopping. Can you tell the court what you were actually doing? Caroline leaned toward the microphone. Her voice was steady, resonant, and completely devoid of fear. While my husband was working 80-hour weeks, he was also spending his nights in hotel rooms with his marketing directors, his executive assistants, and occasionally his investors. Objection, Preston barked. Relevance goes to state of mind, Your Honor, Madeleine shot back. I'll allow it, the judge ruled, but tread carefully. I knew about the affairs by year 3 of our marriage, Caroline continued, her eyes never leaving Nathaniel's. But I also knew I had signed a prenuptial agreement that left me with virtually nothing if I walked away. I realized I was entirely dependent on a man who viewed me as furniture. So I decided to make myself indispensable. How did you achieve that, Mrs. Hayes? I started studying. When Nathaniel was out, I audited online computer science courses from MIT and Stanford. I hired private tutors under aliases. I spent 12 hours a day immersed in data architecture, coding languages, and cloud logistics. I had unparalleled access to Omnitech's internal struggles because Nathaniel would frequently leave his laptops open or loudly complain about the server bottlenecks during his brief stops at home. Nathaniel's jaw dropped. The realization was hitting him like a freight train. Every time he had vented about a coding nightmare over dinner, dismissing her silent nods as wifely obedience, she had been taking mental notes. In 2013, Caroline said, Omnitech was bleeding capital due to exorbitant cloud storage costs. I saw a mathematical solution. I drafted the framework for a new data compression algorithm. I even brought it to him. You showed Mr. Hayes the Nexus algorithm, Madeleine asked, feigning surprise. I tried, Caroline corrected. I printed out 40 pages of structural code. I walked into his home office and told him I thought I had a way to cut server costs in half. Do you remember what you said to me, Nathaniel? Nathaniel stared at her, utterly paralyzed. I'll remind you, Caroline said, her voice dropping to a deadly whisper. You laughed. You threw the pages in the trash without looking at them. You told me to stay out of the adult conversations and go pick out new curtains for the Aspen house. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. So, I took my code out of the trash, Caroline stated matter-of-factly. I spent the next year refining it. I used the money my grandmother left me to hire a corporate attorney in Delaware. I established Signet Ventures, LLC. I patented the Nexus algorithm under the company's name, and then I had my broker approach Omnitech with a blind offer. Nathaniel bought my code for $2 million because a man in a suit pitched it to him. If I had handed it to him for free, he would have let his company go bankrupt rather than admit his wife was smarter than him. Preston Gallagher practically vaulted over the plaintiff's table. This is a captivating fairy tale, Your Honor, but it is legally moot. Even if Mrs. Hayes wrote the code, which we still vehemently contest, she did so while married to my client. Under Illinois law, any asset created during the marriage is considered marital property. That algorithm belongs to the marital estate, which means at least 50% of it belongs to Mr. Hayes. Preston looked triumphant, breathing heavily as if he had just scored the winning touchdown. He had found the life raft. Furthermore, the prenuptial agreement clearly states that any intellectual property developed for Omnitech is the sole property of the company. Madeleine Rousseau smiled. It was a terrifying, predatory smile. "Oh, Mr. Gallagher," Madeleine purred. "I was really hoping you would bring up the prenuptial agreement. The one you drafted." Madeleine walked to the defense table and picked up a thick, bound document. She walked over and slammed it down onto Preston's table, right in front of Nathaniel. "Let's look at Section 9, Clause 4 of your ironclad prenuptial agreement," Madeleine instructed. "Would you care to read it, Preston, or shall I?" Preston stared at the page, his face draining of whatever color was left. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. "I'll read it," Madeleine said, projecting her voice to the back of the room. "Any corporate entity, LC, or holding company entirely owned and registered by one spouse, and any intellectual property, patents or assets held strictly within that entity, shall remain the sole, separate, and untouchable property of that spouse in the event of dissolution of marriage. The other spouse waives all rights to claim said entity as marital property." Madeleine turned to the judge. "Your Honor, 10 years ago, Mr. Hayes insisted on this exact clause to ensure that if he ever started side businesses or spin-off tech companies under new LLCs, his wife couldn't touch them in a divorce. He built a fortress to lock her out." She walked back to Caroline, resting a hand on her client's shoulder. "But he didn't realize he was giving my client the exact same protection. Signet Ventures LLC is entirely owned by Caroline Hayes. The Nexus algorithm is patented strictly under Signet Ventures. By Mr. Hayes's own fiercely protected legal contract, he has absolutely no claim to it. It is her sole property." Judge Patterson read over the clause, then looked at the unsealed registry, and finally leaned back in his chair. A faint, almost imperceptible smirk touched the corners of the old judge's mouth. "It appears, Mr. Gallagher, that your client has hoisted himself by his own petard. The clause is unambiguous." "Your Honor, you can't be serious," Nathaniel shouted, standing up again. "She's extorting me. The license expired 2 days ago. If she shuts off my access to that code, Omnitech breaches contracts with the federal government. The fines alone will bankrupt the company by Friday. I'll lose everything." "That sounds like a corporate logistical issue, Mr. Hayes," Judge Patterson replied coldly. "Not a family court matter." "No," Nathaniel slammed his hands on the table. He looked wildly at Caroline. "Caroline, please, you can't do this. I built this company. It's my life." Caroline looked down at him from the witness stand. "You didn't build it, Nathaniel. You sold a pretty interface. I built the engine, and you are right. The license has expired. As the CEO of Signet Ventures, I am legally obligated to protect my intellectual property. If Omnitech is found using the Nexus algorithm past midnight tonight without a renewed license, I will file an injunction and a federal lawsuit for IP theft." Nathaniel looked like a man standing on the gallows, watching the lever being pulled. "What do you want?" he choked out, the arrogance entirely stripped from his voice. "You want 50% of Omnitech? Fine. We rip up the prenup. We split everything down the middle. Just renew the license." "I don't want 50%, Nathaniel," Caroline said softly. "I told you. I read the corporate bylaws very carefully." Madeleine pulled a final document from her folder and slid it across the table toward Nathaniel. "This is a new licensing agreement. Caroline explained, her voice echoing in the dead, silent courtroom. Signet Ventures will grant Omnitech a perpetual license to the Nexus algorithm. In exchange, the renewal fee is not $2 million. The fee is the immediate transfer of 80% of your Class A voting shares in Omnitech to my name, along with your immediate resignation as Chief Executive Officer. Preston gasped. That's a hostile takeover. She's stealing your company. I am not stealing anything, Caroline corrected sharply. I am offering a business transaction to a desperate buyer. You can sign the shares over to me, walk away with your 20% and your young marketing director, and watch me take the company to valuations you couldn't even dream of. Or you can refuse. And at 12:01 a.m. tomorrow, I shut down the servers. Omnitech goes into catastrophic default, your stock plummets to zero, and you spend the rest of your life fending off federal lawsuits from the Department of Defense. Caroline leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. You called me worthless today, Nathaniel. Let's find out what you're worth without me. Nathaniel stared at the contract. His hands shook violently. He looked at Preston, begging for a legal miracle. But the high-priced lawyer just stared at the floor, utterly defeated. There were no loopholes left. There was no escape. Slowly, agonizingly, Nathaniel reached into his jacket. He pulled out his platinum fountain pen. With a trembling hand, he signed his name on the dotted line, signing away his empire, his power, and his pride. Judge Patterson struck his gavel. Court is adjourned. 10 minutes later, Caroline Hayes walked out the heavy oak doors of courtroom 302. The storm outside had broken, and shafts of pale afternoon sunlight were piercing through the courthouse windows. She didn't look back at the broken man weeping at the plaintiff's table. She adjusted her pearls, stepped out into the bustling Chicago streets, and hailed a cab to go to her new office. If you loved watching this arrogant billionaire get exactly what he deserved, hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible real-life revenge stories. Don't forget to share this video with someone who needs a reminder to never underestimate the quiet ones. Drop a comment below on what you would have done in Caroline's shoes. See you in the next video.